Good morning and namaste to all of you. So today we're going to start looking at chapter 18. And these days in this class, we are looking at the summary of the chapters. So let's see if we can finish half of this chapter. This chapter 18 is a long chapter. So either half or even 1/3. So let's see how it goes. Okay. But before we start, let's do the Gita Dhyana. Om Parthaye Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayan Swayam Vyasen Grathitam Puran Munina Badhe Mahabharatam Advaitam Ritvarchini Bhagavati Mashtadashadhyayani Am Tvam Anusandhami Bhagavata Gite Bhavadveshini Namo Astu Te Vyas Vishal Buddhe Full Arvind Ayat Patra Netha Yentavya Bharat Tail Purnaha Prajito Gyan Mea Parvipaha पर पान पारी जाता है तोत्र वेत्र एक पान है ज्ञान मुद्राए कृष्णाए गीता अमृत दुहे नमः सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दोग्धा गोपाल नंदना पार्थो वत्सा सुधीर भोगता दुग्धम गीता अमृतम महत वसुदेव सुतम देवम कंस चानूरमर्दनम देवकी परमानंदम कृष्णम वंदे जगतगुरुम भीष्म द्रोण जयद्रथ जला गांधार नीलोत्पला शल्य ग्रावती कृपेन वहनी कर्णेन वेलाकुला अश्वत्थाम विकर्ण घोर मकरा दुर्योधन अवर्तनी सो तीर्णा खलु पांडवे रन नदी कवर्तका केशवा पाराशर्य वत्सरोज अम्लम गीता अर्थगंधोटिकम नानाख्यान केसरम हरि कथा संबोधन अबोधितम लोके सज्जन षटपदय रह पेपियमानम मुदा याद भारत पंकजम कलिमल प्रध्वंसी न श्रेयसे मूकम करोति वाचालम पंगुम लंघ्यते गिरम यत्कृपातमं वंदे परमानंद माधवम यम ब्रह्म वरुण इंद्र रुद्र मरुतः स्तुन्वन्ति दिव्यस्तवे वेदै सांग पद क्रमोपनिषदै गायन्ति यम सामगा ध्यानवस्थित तद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यम योगिनः यस्यन्तं न विदुषुर असुरगणा देवाय तस्मै नमः. So chapter 18, Moksha Sanyasa Yoga, that is the name of this chapter. And this is a closing chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And in fact, it is a summary of the entire Song of Lord. We saw in second chapter earlier, the summary of Gita in anticipation. And now in this 18th chapter, Lord Krishna is giving us a report on the Gita in retrospect. So that chapter was very long, and this chapter is very long too. And in the last few chapters, we saw that it has been proved that everywhere one eternal spirit functions through matter. And it comes to express itself in this pluralistic world of phenomena. So in this chapter, again, we will see an elaborate and exhaustive discussion on how these three guns, three temperaments, in their variations create differences among individuals. In wisdom, in actions, in sacrifice, in fortitude, and even in happiness. Also, two familiar terms which Lord Krishna has been using, sannyas and tyaga. Very often he used in different contexts with different imports. Sannyas is renunciation and tyaga is abandonment. So in this chapter, we see that in order to remove any kind of a confusion, Lord Krishna is giving further explanation after Arjun asks this. He wants to know clearly what these two terms mean. So this chapter opens with a direct question from Arjun as to what constitutes sannyas and what the contents of Tyag are. So verse number 1, Arjun says, I desire to know severely, O mighty armed, the essence or truth of renunciation. So that is sannyasa, as also of abandonment, O slayer of Keshi. So he uses two different terms for Lord Krishna, Rishikesh and slayer of Keshi. Keshi was a demon which Lord Krishna killed. So sannyasasya mahabaho tattvam ichhami vedutam tyagasya cha hrishikesh prithak keshi nishudan. So this chapter, at least in the beginning, it revolves around the meaning of these two terms. Remember that sannyas without the spirit of tyag is incomprehensible. So the bulk of the chapter maps out the tendencies, the urges, impulses, and motives that are to be abandoned. That's a tyag. So that we can have a true abandonment of the undivine personality. So that's why we have to read this chapter in this spirit. What do we need to remove in our personality? What do we need to tyag? Otherwise, it will surely fail to influence us. So defining these terms and indicating the entire significance of their connotations, Lord Krishna says, verse number 2, the sages understand sannyas to be the renunciation of works with desire. And the wise declare the abandonment of the fruits of all actions as tyag. So totally giving up all desire-prompted activities is sannyas. Okay? So totally giving up all desire-prompted activities is sannyas. And abandonment or the tyag is giving up of all anxieties for enjoying the fruits of the actions. So these are like a key difference between tyag and sannyas. So both mean actually giving up the desire, but tyag is slightly different from sannyas. And yet, tyag has an integral relationship with sannyas. So that means that you cannot walk on the path of sannyas without walking on the path of tyag first. So the fruit is what we reap later on as a result of the present action. So action must be done. So a desireless action belongs to the present, while the anxiety to enjoy the fruit is a disturbance of our mind regarding a future period of time. Desire and agitations bring about restlessness. And the deeper the desire, the greater is the amount of dissipation of our energies within. Desire is always ordered by the ego. So remember, the renunciation or the sannyas is the goal to be reached through the process of tyag, abandonment, of our moment-to-moment anxiety to enjoy the fruits. So abandonment or tyag is the means to reach the goal of sannyas. Okay, so sannyasi has to be a tyagi, and tyagi is not a sannyasi yet. Remember that. So tyag is the first level, and sannyas is higher than that. Now the question is, should the ignorant perform work or not? Verse number 3 in this chapter number 18, Lord Krishna says that all actions should be abandoned as evil, declare some philosophers, while others declare that acts of sacrifice, gift, and austerity should not be relinquished. So he's talking about different philosophies over here. He's not giving his opinion over here. So, and we talked about, we saw how he explained this sacrifice, gift, and austerity. Sacrifice word, the Sanskrit word for that is yajna, and gift means dan, and austerity means tap. We saw in detail how the last chapter covered that. Yajna, dan, tapaha, karam, na tyajyam, iti cha apare. So some people say, no, we should not let go of these actions. But there are others, they say, don't do any action at all. So in the previous verse, it was conclusively declared that tyag is the way and total sannyas is the goal. And as students of Gita, we should know that Lord Krishna wants Arjuna only to renounce all evil activities. All evil activities and perform worldly work in a spirit of dedicated, selfless devotion. Because he's asking him to wage this war because this is his duty to do. So the Lord's decree is that the ignorant should perform work also. Verse number 4, he says, hear from me the conclusion or the final truth. So after giving the opinions of other people, he says, listen to my word now. About this abandonment, he says, O best of the Bharats, abandonment verily has been declared to be of three kinds. So now he is going to define it further for us. There could be a tamsik tyag, rajsik tyag, or a satvik tyag. So he says this tyag can be threefold. So all through Bhagavad Gita, this threefold classification is followed. And everywhere we find that is classified as satvik, rajsik, or tamsik. Okay. So clearly, Lord Krishna says that don't let go of your duties. Okay. Work must be done. And what is in verse number 5, he says, acts of sacrifice, yajna, charity, and austerity should not be abandoned, but should be performed. Worship, charity, and also austerity are the purifiers of even the wise. So these are the actions which will purify us further. Even if the wise people are doing it, then we should definitely do it. So these actions, yajna, dan, and tapa, when properly pursued, they bring a brilliant discipline within us, and they create a condition under which the highest spiritual unfoldment and the final experience of the infinite is possible. So Lord Krishna says here that these can purify even a thoughtful man. Wise means a thoughtful man. Men of evolutionary tendencies who seek freedom from their personality obsessions must, with the devotion and the right attitude of mind, perform these yajna, dan, and tapa. And that's how they can discover an endless amount of inner peace and balance. Because ultimately that's what a wise person is looking for. Inner peace and balance. He says obligatory works should be performed without attachment. Verse number 6, he says, but even these actions should be performed leaving aside attachments and the fruits. O Parth, This is my certain and best belief. So don't abandon the action, but abandon the attachment and the fruits. So even these actions, namely yajna, dan, and tap, should be performed leaving attachments and fruits. So for a seeker of spiritual liberation, work is unavoidable. And with a proper spirit of tyag, work can help us on our path. Now he gives us a definition of a tamsik tyag. Because tamsikta we should let go. That is a very lower tendency. Rajsikta also we got to reduce. So he says tamsik tyag is verse number 7. The renunciation of obligatory actions is not proper. The abandonment of the same from delusion is declared to be tamsik. Okay, so that means there is a not right understanding. So abandonment of the same from delusion. So whenever the mind is deluded, that means it's a tamsik. So abandonment of obligatory duties is considered by Lord Krishna as the lowest and the darkest. Because every individual has his or her own obligations to himself or herself and to others in the society. And we have talked about it earlier. They could be the daily duties as well as the special duties. So out of ignorance and lack of proper thinking, if a person ignores the obligations and refuses to serve the society, he is living in that tyag, is tamsik. And what is a rajsik tyag? He who from fear of bodily trouble abandons action because it's painful. Thus, performing a rajsik abandonment obtains not the fruit of abandonment. So that means when we just, because of the comfort of this body, and I don't want to do my obligatory duties, let somebody else do it. He says it's a rajsik tyag. So to become a person of action, fulfilling all obligations and performing all duties without sacrificing your personal comforts, that is not a heroic life at all. And what is a sattvic tyag? Whatever obligatory action is done, O Arjuna, merely because it ought to be done, abandoning attachment and also fruit, that abandonment is regarded as sattvic. So we got to do our duties. What we need to abandon is attachment to the fruits of our actions. Not the actions, but the fruits. So certain acts of relinquishment must be done. So tyag of the sattvic, a real tyag means doing actions with the correct mental attitude. So it's not the physical actions, but the mental attitude which really makes it a sattvic tyag. It's not so much on what is to be relinquished, but as to how we must abandon, in which field we must act. So to Lord Krishna, tyag is a subjective renunciation of all inner selfishness and desire, which limit the freedom of the individual in his or her field of activity. Okay, so you got to let go of the selfishness. That is a tyag. So in these 3 verses, the tyag discussed, we can clearly see is not the abandonment of action, but abandonment of such things within our subjective personality that block the free flow of our own possibilities. And how does such a pure person, purified through sattvic tyag, come to gain the highest spiritual experience? Verse number 10, he says, the abandoner, soaked in purity, being intelligent, with all his doubts cut asunder, hates not a disagreeable action, nor is he attached to an agreeable action. So what needs to be done, the Satvik Tyagi does it. No likes and dislikes. Total focus on what I'm supposed to do. So that person does not become a victim of his or her own mental impressions, the vasanas. Stands ever free and surely apart from the restlessness of the mind. Because whenever we have too many likes and dislikes, there's a restlessness in the mind. A sattvic person has a very calm mind. Such a person is said to be a wise person. There is an unbroken equanimity and steady understanding. And there is a constant memory of these four things. The constituents of the field of his activity. So whatever action he's doing, where is he doing it? The instruments through which he contacts the world outside. His own essential, infinitely divine nature. So this Tyagi never forgets the essence. And the number 4, his exact relationship with the world of objects when he is contacting it through his senses. So that means lives in this world with eyes open, but never forgetting who he or she is. Such a person, Lord Krishna called it Medhavi. That human being has a firm understanding, Medhavi. Verse number 11. Verily, it is not possible for an embodied being to abandon actions entirely. And we learned that in a Karam Yoga section also. We cannot abandon actions entirely. But he who relinquishes the fruits of actions is verily called a Tyagi. Okay? So Tyagi does not mean no actions. Tyagi means relinquish the fruits of the actions. That doesn't mean the fruits won't come, but don't keep the fruits in your mind. Actions we will have to perform. Without action, no living organism can continue living. Because we know that breathing itself is an action. Walking is an action. Sitting is an action. Okay? So that's why he says, you got to continue doing the action. A person who abandons the thirst to enjoy the fruits of his action is called a Tyagi. So write it down. A person who abandons the thirst to enjoy the fruits. And where does the thirst is? In our mind. So a person who abandons the thirst to enjoy the fruits of his actions is called a Tyagi. Now, what is the benefit which comes from Tyaga? Because if we got to work on it, we got to know what is the benefit. Lord Krishna says in verse number 12, the threefold fruits of actions, evil, good, and mixed, accrues after death only to those who have no spirit of abandonment. Never to total relinquisher. So pap, punya, or mixed. Some pap and some punya. So he says, they accrue all our actions, whether they are fall into the pap section or punya section or the mixed. So he says, this accrual happens only if you are not a Tyagi. If you become a Tyagi, then you are free of it. For a person of renunciation, there's no reaction either to the actions done in the past or the actions undertaken by him in the present. So Tyag is that capacity in us with which from moment to moment we withdraw ourselves from the impulses of our mind. Okay. While sannyas is the total renunciation of the entire tendencies, both good and bad, from their crystallization as the ego. Gita technique for the rehabilitation of a human's personality. Number one, a seeker first gets detached from the lower sensuous cravings and passions by identifying himself with the nobler ideas of self-control and moral perfections. Okay, so that means what should we do? What is good for us? And then number two, a mind so conditioned becomes tamer. See, that's how we tame our mind. Otherwise, mind is like a wild monkey. So this purified mind develops itself the required amount of subtle powers of thinking. So mind becomes very subtle. We can consistently apply ourselves. And we can do the steady contemplation. So in order to study, in order to contemplate, we need to have a subtler mind, a quieter mind. And number three is we start realizing pure beingness. And all the becomings end. To the pure self, there is no becoming. The tendencies of this mind vasanas cannot shackle the spirit. So that's why this tyag is so important. Even though it's a first step, but it is so important so that our mind is restful. Agitated mind is no good. So those who abandon both the sense of ego and the anxiety for the action, the results are not caught in the clutches of reaction actions. So after handling the abandonment in general, Lord Krishna is taking us to a closer examination of dissecting the very component parts constitute the work. Because we do work all the time, there are some constituent parts of the action. He says, verse number 13, learn from me, O mighty armed, these 5 causes for the accomplishment of all actions, as declared in the Sankhya system. See, Sankhya is there's a yogic philosophy, there's a Sankhya philosophy also. So Sankhya system, which is the end of all actions. End of all actions means you know who is doing the action. The real you is not, only the Prakriti part is. That is the end of the actions. The doership settles down. For the real accomplishment, fulfillment, or achievement of an action, 5 aspects of action are necessarily to be disciplined and marshaled. These 5 are the limbs of actions, without which no action is ever possible. So 5. In the verse number 14, he enumerates these 5 factors, which are the constituent parts in all the actions. He says the seat, the doer, the various kinds of instruments, the different functions of various organs of action, and also the presiding deity, the 5th. So in our own body also we can look at it. The seat is the body, the doer is the ego, the various kinds of organs of perceptions, different functions of various organs of actions, and the presiding deity, the energy which is being given to us. But we can take it into the outer world also. We can say where we are doing it. I always like to give the example of a farmer in Florida bring the oranges. So the place is the Florida, the climate over there. He cannot take credit for it. Karta, sure he is doing it. So 1/5. Then he has the instruments, the tractor and all kinds of machinery which is available to him. He cannot take credit for that. Somebody else developed that. Then he had the skillfulness. That was also taught by somebody else at some other time. And the 5th is the weather condition. That is Devam. So Adhishtanam tatha karta karnam cha pritak vidam vividha cha pritak cheshta Devam cha eva atra pancham. Okay. So there's so many factors. So 5 factors, and we really cannot say that I did it. Sure, I did 1/5 of it. So this verse is dedicated merely to enumerate these 5 aspects, without which no egocentric activity is ever possible. So 5 are always needed. If we remember this, at the time of a success, we don't become arrogant. We can take credit only of the 1/5. And when we fail also, result is not the way we wanted it, then we don't go into depression either. We tried our best. Okay. So how can these 5 become the component parts in every human activity? He says in verse number 15, whatever action a man performs by his body, speech, and mind. Because we do actions with these body, speech, and mind. Whether right or the reverse, these 5 are its causes. So many actions all day long we do it. So these 5 are the constituents of any actions. So the items listed above must all come into full play in order to accomplish any action. So these 5 component parts are called the causes of all the actions. So all these enumerations and explanation of the last 2 verses add up to what constitute the action. The sense of agency of the sense self is an illusion. Now, such being the case, he says in verse number 16, verily he who owing to his untrained looks upon his self, which is alone as the doer, he of perverted intelligence sees not. So in other words, Lord Krishna is saying, if a person wants to take the 100% credit for something, that person doesn't see well. He uses the word perverted intelligence if somebody wants to take the full credit of something. So the supreme pure self is misunderstood by the ordinary person to be the actor. And the consequent ego sense, the divinity, is forgotten. And the individual comes to despair. That happens with a durbuddhi, perverted intelligence. So untrained, untempered reason and perverted mind, see, in Sanskrit terms he uses akrit buddhi and durmati, are the maladjustments in an individual, because of which right recognition of our own divinity is not constantly maintained within. So that means we forget who we are. Lord Krishna continues this same idea in verse number 17. He who is free from the egoistic notion, whose intelligence is not tainted by good or evil, though he slays these people, he slays not, nor is he bound by the action. So remember, this whole Bhagavad Gita was sung in the middle of the war. So that's why The terms he uses over here, slaves. And Arjun didn't want to wage the war. So he is telling him how to wage the war. Abandon the fruits of the actions. Remember who the actor is, who is really doing the action. So an egoless person of wisdom, when he works in any field, is expressing the infinite will, and in that attitude of total surrender and complete dedication, no action can leave any impression in his mind. So after describing the constituents that make up any action, Lord Krishna describes the impulse to karam and the basis of karam. See, just remember, this is like a beautiful textbook, and he keeps on opening it for us, just not leaving karam as karam, but impulse to karam and the basis of karam. Verse number 18, he says, knowledge, the known, and the knower form threefold impulse to action. Jnanam, Gyayam, Parigyata. Those are the impulse to action. The organs, the action, the agent form the threefold basis of action. Karnam, Karam, Karta. So 6 things over here in this verse number 18. Knower means the experiencer. Known is experienced, and the resultant is the knowledge. Without these 3, no knowledge is ever possible, as all impulses to act arise out of a play of these 3. Knowledge is needed, known has to be there, and the knower has to be there too. So the impulse to action can spring either the experiencer in the form of a desire, or from the experienced in the form of temptation, or from the experience in the form of similar memories of some past enjoyment. Beyond these 3, there is no other impulse to act. The impulse to action, when it has arisen, must also find a field to act in. And the basis for action is constituted of the instruments, the reactions, and the agent, the actor. So these 3, Karnam, Karta, and Karam, are together designated as the parts of the Karam assembly, the basis of all actions. So you had a desire to drink water, then you got to go into the kitchen to find a glass or a cup and water, and you drink it. All of this is needed. And memory means that in the past you knew water can quench the thirst. So that knowledge is needed too. So the Lord now proceeds to show the threefold distinctions in each one of the above according to the 3 predominant natures. The Tamasic, Rajasic, and Sattvic. So that is the main thing over here. He's trying to describe it to us in detail. What is a Sattvic action? What is a Sattvic doer? Or the Rajasic or Tamasic. Verse number 19, knowledge, action, and actor are declared in the science of temperaments, that means guns, to be of 3 kinds only, according to the distinctions of temperaments. Hear them also duly. So this classification is being exhaustively explained in the next few verses. So threefold type of knowledge. Sometimes we think knowledge is just a knowledge, but according to Bhagavad Gita, there is a Sattvic knowledge, there's a Rajasic knowledge, and there's a Tamasic knowledge also. that by which one sees one indestructible reality in all beings, undivided in the divided. Know that knowledge as sattvic. So that knowledge which unites us, that knowledge which says God is everywhere, equally, that knowledge is a sattvic knowledge. The knowledge by which the one imperishable being is seen in all existence is sattvic. There's a God in a plant and God in a bug also. God in a human being, God in the sun and the moon also. That knowledge is a sattvic knowledge. One life throbs in all, expressing itself differently as its different manifestations, because of the different constitution in the matter arrangement. Bottles can have a different shape and a different color, or a bulb can have a blue covering on it, or a red covering on it, or no covering on it, but the light is the same. So when we see the sameness, the essence is the same everywhere. That knowledge is the sattvic knowledge. And what type of the knowledge is a rajasic? That knowledge which sees in all beings various entities of distinct kinds as different from one another. Know that knowledge as a rajasic. So when we start seeing the difference, we think, no, this is bigger, this is smaller. To the Rajasic knowledge, the world is an assortment of innumerable types of different varieties. The intellect of such a person perceives distinctions among the living creatures, divides them into different classes, as the animals, vegetable, human kingdom. But the Sattvic person sees that they look different, but Sattvic person says the essence is the same. Same energy which a human being is growing because of that, the same energy the plant is growing also. So what then is the nature of knowledge of the tamasic? But that knowledge which clings to one single effect as if it were the whole. So this much knowledge and thinking, I know it all. Without reason, without foundation in truth, and narrow, that is declared to be tamasic. Okay, so you can clearly see that sattvic knowledge is which unites us. Tamasic desire is without any basis, and rajasic definitely divides us. To describe tamasic knowledge in Sanskrit, he says, "Atattva, arthvat, alpam cha tat tamsam udahritam." Alpam, alpam means small. Knowing a little, but thinking that I know it all. That is tamasic. So the knowledge of the dull is painted here as that belonging to the lowest types of the spiritual seeker. It's generally a knowledge of a fanatic in their faith and even in their devotion, in their views and values of life. The tamasic person will never inquire into and to try to discover the cause of things and happenings. And he uses the word ahatukam, they are unreasonable. So whenever we become unreasonable, remember that is a tamsikta, dullness. The knowledge of the tamasic is circumscribed by its own concept of self-importance. And its vision becomes narrow and limited. That's why it's called a narrow-minded. To summarize, the knowledge of the sattvic perceives the oneness underlying the universe, The comprehension of the Rajasic recognizes the polarity of the world, and understanding of the Tamasic indicates a highly crystallized self-centered ego in that person. And his view of the world is always perverted and false also. The threefold nature of the action is described in the following verses. Action. See, that was a knowledge, now it's a action. Verse number 23, an action which is ordained, which is free from attachment, which is done without love or hatred, by one who is not desirous of the fruit, that action is declared to be sattvic. We can see that the same scheme of thought. So in sattvic, we got to do it because it's our duty. No love or hatred, no likes and dislikes, no attachment to the fruit. But definitely the action must be done because it's ordained. I'm supposed to do it. So it is an obligatory action. And the work that is undertaken for the work's own sake. Sometimes we say, where do we get motive? Motive comes because it's my duty to do it. With an attitude that work itself is worship. Such activities performed with the spirit of dedication by a sattvic person. It is a dedicated activity of love, and yet it is not propelled by either love or hatred. It's done because it's supposed to be done. Niyatam sangrahitam arag dveshta kritam. So what is a Rajasic action? Verse number 24. That action which is done by one longing for desires or gain, done with egoism or with much effort, is declared to be Rajasic. Okay, so clearly you can see the difference. It's not that sattvic person is not making an effort, but sattvic person's motive is different. Motive is not the fruit. Motive is just to do the duty. So the action of the Rajasic is that which is undertaken to win one's desires with an extremely insistent I act mentality. I am doing it. The I is very strong in that. Rajasic person works generally under tension. That is the effort he's talking about. And strain. Because he comes to believe that he alone can perform it. All the time he's exhausted with his own anxieties and fears. And that's why a Rajasic person stays restless also. Sattvic person is doing a lot, but always calm and restful. Rajasic person, the same action he is doing, but always restless. And restlessness comes from clinging to the fruits. All activities of political leaders, social workers, great industrialists, or even over-anxious parents, fanatic preachers, blind money makers, they are the example of Rajasic actors. And what is a Tamasic action? That action which is undertaken, this is verse number 25, that action which is undertaken from delusion without regard for the consequence, loss, injury, and ability is declared to be Tamasic. So these actors never care for the loss or injury caused to others by their actions. They are careless, irresponsible. These actions have been undertaken because of some delusory misconception of the goal. That's why they fall in the category of tamasic. Habit of gambling, corruption, etc. All they demand is a temporary joy of some sense gratification and some kind of a tickling satisfaction of some fancy of the hour. They just look at it, they say, I'm enjoying it. So tamasic actions immediately provide the performers with a substantial sorrow. Okay. You are drinking and then you are driving and right away you will get caught. So tamasic actions immediately provide the performers with a substantial sorrow. Rajasic actions comparatively takes a longer time to bring its quota of disappointments. Sattvic action is always blissful and steady. I told you this chapter has a lot of knowledge because the last 3 chapters from chapter 13 all the way to this 18, this is the portion where the knowledge is, the gyan. This is like so much knowledge in there. That's why each verse is just loaded. So we're going to stop it here and we'll start with verse number 26. 3 kinds of actors also. So far we talked about 3 kinds of actions, 3 kinds of buddhi. Now the 3 kinds of actors. And we'll start from there next week. Okay. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vishishyate. Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much for listening and coming to the class. See you next week.